But what we're going to do today as we celebrate moms is we're going to look closely at one of history's most famous mothers. And some of you may not even know her name. How many of you have ever heard of a woman by the name of Jochebed? Jochebed. If you know her by name, great. But you definitely know her by reputation. Jochebed was married to a man named Amram. They were both Levites. They were descendants of Levi, which means that their children would later become priests. They would lead the priestly ranks in Jerusalem. And this couple found themselves expecting a child. This would actually be their third child. They already had a daughter named Miriam. She was probably about 5 years old. And they had a son named Aaron. He was probably about 3. Okay, moms, who is this famous mom that we talk about? Jochebed was whose mother? Moses. This is the mother of Moses. Now, when the time came for her child to be delivered, and Jochebed saw how beautiful a son he actually was, she hid him. Wait a minute. What mother hides her beautiful child? That seems a little odd, right? Why would she do that? We're going to look at our text to see if we can discover what would inspire a mom to hide this beautiful son that she has. Join me in chapter 2 of Exodus. We're going to begin reading in verse 1. Now a man from the family of Levi married a Levite woman. The woman became pregnant and gave birth to a son. And when she saw that he was beautiful, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could no longer hide him, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with asphalt and pitch, and she placed the child in it and set it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. Then his sister stood at a distance in order to see what would happen to him. Pharaoh's daughter went down to bathe at the Nile while her servants walked along the riverbank. Seeing the basket along the reeds, she sent her slave girl to get it. When she opened it, she saw the child, a little boy, crying. She felt sorry for him and she said, "This is one of the Hebrew boys." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Should I go and call a woman from the Hebrews to nurse the boy for you?" "Go," Pharaoh's daughter told her. So the girl went and called the boy's mother. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child and nurse him for me, and I will pay your wages." So the woman took the boy and nursed him. When the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him Moses because she said, "I drew him out of the water." Father God, may we find the beautiful truths that you intend in motherhood as we look at this mother you've chosen to record for us, who so famously parented and raised and nurtured the son that you would use to do so many, many great things in the lives of your people. May we be a blessing to our mothers today, and more importantly, may we, as we bless our mothers all together, may we bless you, God. We've invited your Spirit to join us in a special and mighty way, and we've done all of this. Everything we've done today, even the honoring of our mothers, is done with one express purpose, and that is to bring fame to Jesus and to hopefully allow people to see him for the beautiful and wonderful Savior that he is. For it is indeed in that same Jesus' name that we pray. And again, all people said. You're going to need a little background, but you can kind of see why she hid her son, right? But not necessarily completely. Here's what's going on. There was a gentleman named Joseph in the Old Testament. His brothers were jealous of him because he was a favorite son of their parents. Nothing good ever comes of parents having favorite children and allowing the rest of their children to know that. The Bible is fraught with disaster when a mom favors one child over another child. This is one of those examples of what happens. The brothers became jealous. They sold Joseph into slavery. And guess what they told his father had happened to him? They told his father that he had been mauled and killed and eaten by wild beasts. And they took his bloody robe back as evidence. Now, can you imagine hating your brother so much that you would break the heart of your father and mother to that degree? I mean, what's worse than being eaten by wild animals? That's not a good way to go. Well, we find from Joseph's life that while his brothers may have intended all these things for his evil, God intended it for his good. And God makes everything work together in a good way for people that love him. When we're called to the purposes of God, which is this, what's the purposes of God? That I meet Jesus, that I enter a relationship with Jesus, and I show you what it looks like to have a relationship with Jesus so that maybe you'll have one too. That's the purpose of God. And when I follow the purpose of God, God takes every single terrible, negative, awful thing in my life, and he makes a good from it. And we learn that more from Joseph's life than perhaps anybody's. Now, over time, Joseph became the second most powerful man in all of Egypt. That's amazing as a slave. But then, as also as the case, no life lasts forever. In the midst of Joseph's life, he was there leading his people, and he received a vision of a famine that was coming, and he told them to save 7 years worth of food and put it aside because there was going to be a famine and the people would starve otherwise. God turned it to a good. And it turns out that his family back in Israel were a part of the famine, but they didn't have a person seeing from God who could make a provision for them. And so his brothers went to Egypt to try to seek food in the midst of this famine. Guess who they found? They found their brother Joseph. And there was a great reunion, a reconciliation, because that's what God does. God reconciles us to himself, and God reconciles us to each other if we'll allow him to do that. And so in this reconciliation, long story short, 75 people go into Egypt as the children of Jacob. Jacob's name has now been changed to Israel. How many of you knew that the nation of Israel was actually named after a man, an individual? His name was originally Jacob, and God changed his name. So fast forward, Joseph returns to the dust. That Pharaoh returns to the dust. They both pass on, and a new Pharaoh comes along. And in that entire expanse of time, the Hebrews are multiplying. They're taking God's command seriously. Be fruitful and multiply. They're like rabbits. And at this point, there are millions of them. This new Pharaoh begins to see the swelling numbers of these people, and he says, you know what? All they'd have to do is to decide and lead a coup, and they'd overthrow me, and they'd take my kingdom. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to make their life miserable to keep them under my boot, literally and figuratively speaking. It came a point where they had to make bricks without straw. That still didn't work. The numbers swelled the harder they worked them. Here's what we have. When his working them to death didn't work, he went to the two Hebrew midwives and he says, here's what I want you to do. Every time a child is born, a boy child, you're going to kill it. That's going on now in parts of the Eastern world. But these midwives feared God, and they didn't do it. Now God blessed them for refusing to do that and for putting themselves at risk with the Pharaoh. But guess what they told the Pharaoh as to why they couldn't kill these babies when they're born? Ladies, you'll appreciate this. Southern women, especially you hardworking Southern girls, you're going to get a kick out of this. They said to the Pharaoh, well, look, Pharaoh, you don't understand. These Hebrew women ain't like y'all's Egyptian women. They're tough. They have babies go back to work before we can even get there. And so this plan didn't work. It didn't change Pharaoh's heart, though, did it? When the midwives wouldn't kill the boys, guess what Pharaoh did? He made a command. Every boy child that's born, throw it into the river. It'll be food for the crocodiles, or it'll drown, or both. And whether you know it or not, as the devil tried to stop the blessed and righteous and messianic one from coming again, scores of babies, boys, were thrown into the river and died, exposed. Let me show you a quick video.
Come, Ramesses. We will show Pharaoh your new baby brother, Moses.
Now, lest you think this clip is overly dramatized, over the last half a century in the Sudan, there has been an essential genocide of Christian children there. And the children that survived it are called the Lost Boys. And if you've never heard the testimony of any of these Lost Boys, you need to go out and find it. And I don't want to be overly graphic, but I do want you to realize that that is a very fair depiction of what the Nile is like. Because masses of Sudanese children died trying to cross the Nile and running away from the fact that they were being murdered and slaughtered simply because they were Christians. And the news was that the Lost Boys will tell you they drowned, they were eaten by alligators, they were eaten by wild animals. So this is not a far-fetched concept. In fact, we have recent historical evidence of it happening again. Now, we now know why this mother would hide this beautiful child away, right? Now here's what I want us to do, because she hid him and then this extreme act followed that we just saw in the clip. But I want us to look at it and see what we can learn about what mothers are based on her example, based on Jochebed's example. Are you with me? Moms, I want to try to look at Jochebed's example to us and see what we can learn about motherhood from her and see if perhaps it'll translate into our world today. The number one thing I want you to see that mothers are is mothers are optimistic. There was a time in my life I was sitting here thinking, trying to remember when my mind changed about that. I don't remember if it carried on into my early married life with Shelley, but there was a time when I said, you know what? I don't want to have children because I don't want to bring them into a world like this. Have any of you ever felt that way? She didn't. She looked at it and she said, I believe every life is a blessed gift from God, and if God will bless me with this child, we will raise him, even though his birth should have guaranteed his death. Now, we don't know how long the command had been going on. We don't know if they knew he was killing the boys when she got pregnant. We don't know any of that. But what we do know is she knew the risk. I'm going to read some text from the Message translation as we work through today to help you track along with the story in Exodus. The woman became pregnant and had a son. She carried him and brought him into the world at all costs. That last part is my verbiage. She brought this child into the world no matter what it would cost, because she believed, like I believe, and I hope you believe, every life that's conceived is a blessed gift from God. And that life becomes a life while it's still in its mother's tummy. She didn't let the world, the times, the fear, the tragedy determine her child's value. You know how she measured her child's value? Because even in utero, when this child was still being carried by her, she knew how much God valued her child. Now, I want you to think about your children. If they're here, I want you to look at them just for a second, moms. And if they're not with us today, I just want you to think about them. What proves your child's value to God? Do you want me to tell you? A cross. A cross proves your value to God. And children, and all of us are children of someone, it is also where our identity rests. Jochebed was optimistic. The second thing she was discerning. She saw her son for what he was. And it's easy for us to say, oh, of course she did. He was a beautiful, healthy, whatever, strapping young man. I don't believe it would have mattered. I believe she saw her son as a gift from God, regardless of how he may have turned out. But she saw her child for exactly what he was. He was a beautiful, healthy boy. He was a gift from God. The Message says this: she saw there was something special about him. Everyone look at me. No matter how young you are or how old you are today, let me tell you something. And I'm not going to give you the whole tried everybody's a special little snowflake speech. But then I am. God's never made any two of us the same. And there's something about each and every one of us that makes us special. And our mothers are not the only ones that see it. God not only sees it, he designed it while we were in our mother's womb. She knew this as a mother. She was discerning. She saw the hand of God in her child's making. The third thing about her that I really saw as striking is that this woman's heroic. Moms, can you relate? This was a heroic woman. She ignored the threats of the king. Right? She did. Listen to what the message says. She saw there was something special about him and she hid him. Her child came before the threat. Her child came before the penalty. Her child came first for her. She was a hero. She put herself at risk to shelter her child from the threats of the world in which they lived. Can you imagine how long or 3 months that must have been? What if Moses had colic? You ever had them youngins? I thought my children would never shut up screaming and hollering. We burned up so many vacuum cleaners. We burnt up the vacuum cleaners at the church because that one screamed so loud in the nursery that she interrupted the worship service. So Pastor Bob, my mentor, took an old vacuum cleaner. He took the belt off of it. He propped it up against the wall in the nursery, and we burned them up because that would shut her up. Regardless of how your child was in its constitution coming up, whether it had colic or didn't have colic, can you imagine having to hide a child for 3 months? You can't talk to it. You can't reason it. And one thing we know about babies is sometimes you can't comfort them. This is a heroic woman. You know what else she was? She was resourceful. She was resourceful. When hiding him was no longer an option, you know what she did? She took and used every resource available to her in her efforts to try to save her son. Listen to what the message says about this. She got a little basket boat made of papyrus, waterproofed it with tar and pitch, and placed the child in it. She identified what she had, and she used what she had, because that's what moms do. She took advantage of every option in protecting her child from the world. Another beautiful thing about Jochebed is that she was faithful. She was faithful. It's tough. Then she set it afloat in the reeds at the edge of the Nile. You talk about the proverbial rock in the hard place, or as we would say, the lesser of two evils. Can you, moms, this is a lose-lose. Can you imagine the faith it took? The absolute will and the extreme faith in God it took for her to put that baby in the river. I can't even get my mind around it. But you know what that tells us about her? She understood the power of placing her child in God's hands. She understood it, and she acted upon it. She turned that child over to God, the God who had blessed her with him in the first place. Ladies, that's faith. Gentlemen, that's faith. There was a dad involved too. Let me tell you another thing about her. She was proven. She was proven. Her children were her living legacy. And you say, what do you mean by that, Stuart? Let me read something, because I want you to realize she raised an unbelievable daughter. This daughter is probably around 5 years of age. Listen to what it says about how this daughter exhibited her mother. The baby's older sister found herself a vantage point a little way off and watched to see what would happen to him. Pharaoh's daughter came down to the Nile to bathe, and she saw the basket boat floating in the reeds and sent her maid to get it. She opened it and saw the child, a baby, crying. Her heart went out to him. She said, this must be one of the Hebrew babies. She knew what it was. Then his sister was before her. Do you want me to go get a nursing mother from the Hebrews so she can nurse the baby for you? Daggone. When my kids were 5, Teletubbies was about the height of their sophistication. Did she have to be coached? I don't know. But can you imagine? You couldn't even send Jacob after a Kleenex when you still can't send Jacob after a Kleenex. I tease Jacob all the time. He's going to be that guy in one of those high-end laboratories doing multi-million-dollar equations, and he's going to have a spaghetti-o ring around his mouth. You know what I mean? There's all kinds of smarts. Can you imagine a little girl? That's a big sister right there. Her mama raised her right. She was proven. And then the big thing, too, that along with the faith that took to place the baby in the river is just this selflessness that Jochebed had. She was absolutely selfless. Pharaoh's daughter said, reading on in Exodus, "Yes, go." The girl went and called the child's mother. Pharaoh's daughter told her, "Take this baby and nurse him for me. I'll pay you." The woman took the child and nursed him. After the child was weaned, she presented him to Pharaoh's daughter, who adopted him as her son. She named him Moses, pulled out, which is the literal meaning of the word Moses, because she said, "I pulled him out of the water." She put the needs of her child ahead of hers. Girls, are you with me on this? Do you see what's happening here? I don't know that you all do. Let me see if I can map it out for you. She put the needs of her child ahead of hers, even if that meant nursing this child for him to be raised by somebody else. Not just somebody else. She nursed this child to be raised by the daughter of the man who is killing his cousins. She nursed this child and turned him over knowing he's going to be raised in a pagan home that has no fear of God whatsoever. Otherwise, they wouldn't be slaughtering his children. But she had faith in God. And she knew that her child in God's hands, in spite of how the circumstances may appear, was a whole lot better off than he was in her hands. As loving and caring and strong as they may be. She knew there comes a point where we have to trust God because only He can provide in the first place. We don't have security. We don't control things. We don't have a say in things. You think about it today. What can you really control in this life? Nothing. She was forced to accept that truth at the very risk of her own child and at the very pride that had to have existed in the core of her being. She became a paid wet nurse, a slave for the woman who's going to raise her child. Do you see the selflessness of that? Selfless. Her child had to come first in everything. Now, imagine what went through Moses' mother's heart when hiding him quit working. When she realized, I can't hide my son anymore. Letting go of the basket in the river. Turning that defenseless child over to Pharaoh's daughter. A stranger, a foreigner from an anti-Semitic, Hebrew-hating home whose father was pursuing genocide, trying to wipe out her very race. Perhaps it was similar to this. Let me tell you a recent story. It's December of 2005. Tricinda Fox and her month-old baby Eric were in their third-story Bronx apartment. In horror, she realized the building was on fire and that they were trapped. With flames engulfing her third-floor bedroom, Tricinda leaned out the window with her baby. A group of onlookers had gathered some 30 feet below, and they watched with growing concern as smoke billowed around the mother and her infant. Finally, when all other options were exhausted, Tricinda made a rough choice. When all the other options were exhausted, And she found herself having to make a terrible choice, a lesser of two evils, the proverbial rock in the hard place, a lose-lose. She let go. And she dropped her son. And that infant fell 3 stories down into the waiting arms of a gentleman he was pictured, his name is Felix Vasquez. And let me show you how good God is. Guess what Felix did? He worked for the housing authority. He was a catcher on his local baseball team. And above and beyond that, he was trained as a lifeguard. So he caught that baby, he performed mouth to mouth, he resuscitated the baby, and he saved his life. Moments later, Tricinda was rescued and reunited with her child. Neither was seriously injured. And later, when someone asked her about her painful decision, here's what Tricinda said. I prayed that someone would catch him and save his life. I said, God, please save my son. Both of these mothers, Tricinda and Jochebed, in the end, were dropping their child in faith into the waiting but invisible hands of God. We don't always see him, but he's got the whole world in his hands. I'm sure Moses' mother prayed something similar to Lucinda. I'm sure she prayed, God, please save my son's life. God did more than that, as we know in Moses' story. He used him as one of the most mighty men in the history of Christendom, of the faith. Time will tell what God does with little Eric, but I'll tell you what I believe. I believe God's got a purpose for that little boy. I am one that has been preserved by God miraculously for such a time as this. Perhaps Eric is too. Let's bring this into the 21st century. Mothers, we as your family, we want to commission you today, if you'll allow us to, in this pattern, in this model of what Jochebed has shown us that godly mothers are. This is what godly mothers are. And there are other examples in the Bible, but we're going to use hers for today. Is this you? Ladies, is this you? I'm just going to ask you, and I want you to think to yourself. Number one, are you optimistic? Does the world determine your child's value, or does God determine your child's value? Not with lip service, but in reality. Are you discerning? Do you see the very hand of God in the making of that child? Are you heroic? Will you face risk to shelter your child from threats, no matter where they come from? Sometimes the threats come from places where they shouldn't. Are you resourceful? Do you take advantage of every option in protecting your child from the world? Are you faithful? Here's where it gets tough as parents. Now I'm speaking as a father and a husband, and I'm speaking to moms, knowing how hard this is to do. Are you faithful? Let me ask it this way. Do you really, truly understand the power of placing your child into God's hands? Not talking about it, but doing it. There's a country song that came out not too long ago. It's never easy letting go. Perhaps that's what a faithful mother does, though, realizing that that child was a gift from God in the first place. And the best thing you can do for he or she, him or her, is to place that child right back into the hands of the almighty, loving, and powerful God, who is the only one that can control everything anyway. Are you proven? Now, don't hear what I'm not saying here. I was not a good example of how good a mother I had. But at the same time, have you raised your children in such a way to where they're your legacy? If the world looked at your children to see what kind of mother you are, no offense, we're just talking here, we're family. Is that okay? Is that okay? Are you proven? And lastly, are you selfless? Do you put your child's needs ahead of yours? Again, that's not an easy question to answer. Off the top of your head, you'll say, sure, oh, I would let them eat before I ate. That's not what I'm talking about. I know that about you. Sometimes our child's needs are the last thing in the world that we would want to do for them, especially if it's a disciplinary need or if it's a life change need. I don't know. God knows. Is this who we are? I pray that it is. Most of you ladies in the room today, I know you very, very well, and I would be proud to call any of you my mother. But I do want to close with this challenge. We need to walk out of here today, moms like that. Commissioned in the pattern of Jochebed. Optimistic, discerning, heroic, resourceful, faithful. Faithful, proven, faithful, and selfless. If you've never done it before, today is the day that you turn your children over into the hands of God. And Shelly and I know just how terribly hard that is to do. I'll close with a quick story. Most of you know that I followed the wrong life pattern for a good stretch of time, and I broke my mother's heart. Broke her heart. And she will tell you herself that the only way she ever received peace was she absolutely had to give me to God. And you say, well, that's great. That's wonderful Sunday school language. Let me tell you what that meant. My mother finally turned to God and she said, you know what, God? I can't take this anymore, and I know that you can't take it anymore from Stuart either. God, I want you to either get his attention and change his heart by whatever means necessary, or I want you to call him home to you. Because he can't continue living and making that example of Jesus Christ. You understand what she's praying, right? God, either change his heart and get him right or take him out. Hardest prayer she'll tell you that she ever prayed, but you know what she received after she prayed it? Guess what she received? Peace. She received peace. And I am the rest of the story. It took some years, but I'm the rest of the story.